Well, one of my sons, actually, three of my sons sell cars. And one of my sons has a client, and he discovered recently that this particular client was one of the foremost experts in our entire nation on suicide prevention. So while my son is selling him this car, they're having a discussion about suicide prevention and why this guy got into that. He travels all over the nation, sharing, teaching prevention. And he used to be just a clinical psychologist that did counseling with people, but he was really frustrated because he didn't really feel like that he was maximizing his efforts to really help people. And so he decided to begin to do more research on the issue of suicide. And then he started sharing that research. And many of the things that he discovered are now being used by doctors in order to help people who are really struggling in their life with depression. There's a number of ways to commit suicide. One is to do it quickly, but another way to do it is through substance abuse. And a lot of people are committing suicide. It's just taking a long time to do it through substance abuse. And one of the things that this fellow shared with my son was that the reason that most people get to that place where they're willing to take their own life, either quickly or through substance abuse, is that they feel alone. They feel alone. But one of the reasons why they feel alone is that, he said, is that they don't have any, and he didn't use this term that we're using, but they don't have any real life relationships with anybody. In fact, one of the things that has made them feel lonely is that there's not one person on the earth that they're really truthful with. They're always living a lie in some way with everyone else and not being truthful, not being honest. We call it being transparent or being open, and not having real life relationships with others. Well, I heard that story. I thought, well, that's a confirmation of what we're trying to learn how to do as a church. We're trying to learn how to really enter into real life relationships with people. But we believe that Jesus did it and showed us how to do it with his 12 disciples in order that real life relationships would be the rails that effective discipleship happens on in the church. In other words, we form real life relationships with people, and through that comes discipleship the way Jesus did it with his disciples. Now, I thought it was interesting when I heard that story because there was only one of the 12 disciples of Jesus that didn't become a genuine follower of Jesus. And who was it? Judas Iscariot. And what did Judas Iscariot do? He committed suicide. And how did he live? He lived dishonestly. He kept secrets. There was not one person in the world that knew Judas Iscariot other than Jesus. Jesus knew everyone. But not because Judas Iscariot was transparent, not because he was open, not because he was honest. I thought that was interesting. The one person that we see that it didn't happen with as far as really becoming a follower of Jesus was someone who was dishonest and wasn't open with anyone. And so we've been learning now for a number of weeks about the importance of developing real-life relationships when it comes to discipleship with others. And what we've learned is that in order to develop a real-life relationship with someone, it's going to take time. There's got to be a commitment of time for it to form. And then, along with time, there's got to be transparency. There's got to be honesty in order to have a real-life relationship with someone. And then you've got to know the other person. You've got to want to know them. And you've got to be intentional about knowing them. It's not enough for them just to know you because you're being transparent with them. You have to really work to get to know them. And we as human beings are not real naturally open for the most part. And so what do you got to do in order to know people? Well, you've got to learn how to ask meaningful questions. And Jesus was an expert at asking meaningful questions. We've learned that in the Gospels, there's over 300 questions that Jesus asked in the 4 Gospels. And not only, though, do we, in order to have a real-life relationship, do we have to learn how to ask meaningful questions, but we also have to become a good listener. And Jesus was an excellent listener. He wasn't just listening to what people said or the circumstances that people were in. He was looking for the deeper issues. And what were people feeling behind the issues that were going on in their life? What were they struggling with? And then we started last week talking about comfort and how important it is in real-life relationships that we learn how to comfort people. And this is something that Jesus was just so skilled at, and it explains so much about him. And so we're going to focus more on that. We started this last week, but I want to bring you up to date on what I said about comfort. I said that in order to comfort people, Jesus demonstrated to us what that looked like. And we looked at one of the stories where he really comforted people. And one of his best friends died, Lazarus. And Lazarus had 2 sisters, Mary and Martha. And so in order to comfort them, we saw Jesus had to be with them. He had to go be with them in order to comfort them. His presence was important in order to comfort them. And in order to comfort them, that would take time and money in order to be with them. It normally does take time and money in order to be with someone, in order to comfort them. But we also saw that Jesus, when he got there, he spoke comforting words to them, both to Mary and to Martha. And in order to speak comforting words, I think all of us would agree, you better have some wisdom about knowing the right words to say. And we talked about a lot of the wrong words that we can say that really aren't very comforting when people are hurting and they're going through pain. But then the other thing that Jesus did is he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and he knew that. In fact, it's one of the reasons why he delayed his coming, because he knew Lazarus was sick, but instead of coming right away, he delayed his coming because he knew there was a bigger plan. And the bigger plan was Jesus was going to perform this miracle and raise Lazarus from the dead. But it's interesting because when Jesus went to raise Lazarus from the dead, he saw how everyone else was mourning and weeping, and the Bible says Jesus wept. He mourned with them. He knew he was going to raise him from the dead. I mean, I would have had a tendency, while everybody else was weeping and stuff, to just sort of make light of it. You're like, oh, I've got a surprise that can't be beat. You guys are going to be, I'm going to change this in just a moment. No, he saw them hurting, and he hurt with them. Even though he knew what was going to happen, he wept with them. I tell you what, that's really consoling to me when someone close to me dies. I mean, God knows what's going to happen. He knows we're all going to end up in heaven, those of us that believe in Jesus. We're all going to be raised from the dead. But it lets me know that when I'm mourning and I'm weeping, what does God do? He mourns with me. In fact, there's a verse in Psalms that says that when I cry, God stores up my tears. It means that much to him. So we don't worship a God who's just out there in the distance somewhere, who's impersonal and unemotional when we're suffering. No, we see right from Jesus, who was the manifestation of who God is. Jesus knew he was going to rise from the dead, raise Lazarus from the dead. He still wept with him. And what do we have to have in order to mourn with people? Well, we've got to feel compassion like Jesus did. We've got to have compassion for people in order to really mourn with them and in order to comfort them whenever they're going through a difficult time. And that's what we're going to focus on for a few minutes this morning. We're going to focus on compassion. You know, when Jesus looked at the religious system that was alive and well in his nation, the nation of Israel, what he saw in that religious system that really bothered him was a lack of compassion. And one of the stories where he pointed that out is in Matthew chapter 9 and verses 9 through 13. I'm going to read this to you. It's a short story, but listen to what Jesus says to the religious leaders of his day. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." So Matthew arose and followed him. Now it happened as Jesus sat at the table in the house, and this was the house of Matthew, a known sinner and tax collector, because all tax collectors were thought to be frauds and sinners to the Jews, that behold, many tax collectors. In other words, it just wasn't one. There was many tax collectors and sinners came and sat down with Jesus and his disciples. And when these religious leaders saw it, they were called the Pharisees. When they saw what Jesus was doing, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" You see, when you sit down to eat with someone, it was demonstrating to them that you valued them, that they were important. It would demonstrate to them that you wanted them to be blessed if you sat down and you ate with them. So here Jesus was doing that. And here's what Jesus said when he heard about their comments. "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And here's what he said. "Those who are well have no need of a doctor, but those who are sick need a doctor." And then he said, "But go and learn what this means." And here he is. He points out the problem in the religious leaders. And here's the problem. He said, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Now, this word mercy that Jesus chose to use in this situation comes from a Greek word. If you're not familiar with the New Testament, it was originally written in Greek. And so it comes from a Greek word that means compassion. That's what that word means, that word mercy. It means compassion. And so what Jesus was saying to these religious leaders, it was actually a rebuke. He said, "You're willing to make sacrifices to perform religious acts. In other words, you're willing to go to the temple there and make sacrifices to perform religious acts. You're willing to show up at church. You know, you're willing to do those kinds of acts and make sacrifices to do them, but you don't have compassion. Learn what that means. Learn what that means. You don't have compassion." What we see in the life of Jesus is that Jesus' acts came from a heart of compassion. Throughout the New Testament, the Bible tells us Jesus was moved with compassion and then he acted. Moved with compassion and then he acted. For example, Matthew 9:36, "But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them because they were weary and scattered like sheep, having no shepherd." And then in Matthew 14:14, "And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them, and he healed their sick." And then Matthew 15:32, "Now Jesus called his disciples to himself and said, 'I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way.' And he fed them." It all started with him being moved by compassion. Now, we see this in our society, don't we, all the time? We see in our world that we live in the United States, we see a society that is moved by compassion pretty frequently. I would say we at least see it on an annual basis. A hurricane comes and strikes the southern coast, and the destruction is just incredible. And what do you see in the people of our nation? You see compassion. I mean, people start giving all kinds of money and resources. People start streaming to that location in order to help the people there who are suffering due to that tragedy. Why do they do it? Well, they do it because they are moved with compassion. We see this all the time in Oklahoma. We're getting ready to enter into tornado season. And what did we see when a tornado rips through more? We've seen compassion. Just thousands of people coming out to help with removal of all the storm debris, and then all kinds of money being given to people in order to help them during their time of tragedy. And so we see this. What was in Jesus, he was moved with compassion, and then he acted, and he met the need. And of course, there wasn't a need that Jesus couldn't meet because he was God, okay? So he wasn't limited in his resources. Well, the world, our society, is moved with compassion to comfort people that are perceived as innocent when they suffer a tragedy. And I want you to understand that's a good thing. I mean, if you really want a response to raise money, all you have to do is put up some faces of some children that are being neglected and are not being fed. And people are going to be moved with compassion to give to help those particular children. And I want you to understand that is a good thing. But here's what I want you to understand about Jesus that separates him is what was extraordinary about Jesus is that he was moved with compassion to comfort people that were guilty, not innocent. I want to say that again because this is the heart of this message. He was moved with compassion to help people that were guilty and not innocent. Just think about it. He's in the home of Matthew the tax collector, a fraud, a thief in the eyes of the Jews. And Jesus was showing compassion for him. Just think about it. The woman that was caught in adultery, Jesus showed compassion for her. Just think about the woman in Samaria who had been married multiple times, and she was living with a man who wasn't her husband. And Jesus was moved with compassion for her. Think about the thief on the cross, and we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. The thief on the cross, I mean, he was there because he was guilty, and Jesus showed compassion for him. And then what about those who executed Jesus? He showed compassion for them. You see, what made Jesus so extraordinary when it came to compassion is that Jesus showed compassion and comforted those who were guilty. Now let that sink into your life for just a moment and think about how you relate to people that are guilty. Do you show compassion to people that you know are guilty? I want you to understand Jesus being like this was just perplexing to those religious leaders, and they couldn't figure it out. I mean, they weren't that way. They might rally together to help one of their own if some tragedy struck. But when it came to helping out these guilty people, no way. And it perplexed them. They thought fraternalizing with sinners would make them unclean. They thought this would enable sinners to continue in their sin. If you fraternize with them, they may think that you think it's okay what they're doing. They thought it was not good for their reputation to fraternize with sinners. Hey, does it sound like anybody you know? Does it sound like the Church of Jesus Christ in the United States? What Jesus saw as comforting those who were guilty, Jesus saw it as being the light that pointed people to God, because that's what God does. God is compassionate toward those who are guilty. And he moves to comfort those who are guilty, even now. So how do we have compassion for people and comfort them even though they are guilty? Well, in Luke's account of the crucifixion of Jesus in Luke 23:26 through 46, Luke recalled 3 things that Jesus said while Jesus was hanging on the cross. Now, it's interesting because Jesus said more things than what Luke recorded. But in the Gospel of Luke, the account that Luke wrote, he recorded 3 things that Jesus said while he was hanging on the cross. And here's what Jesus said when he was hanging on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And then he said to the thief, one of the thieves that was hanging on the cross with him, today you will be with me in paradise. And then the last thing that Jesus said was, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. And what we can see in those 3 things that Jesus said, we can see how and even why Jesus had compassion for those who are guilty. Uh-oh. I lost my tack. My trifocals aren't working.
There you go.
Thank you very much. So this is why, or you could even say how, Jesus had compassion for people that were guilty. And I'm just going to put this up here for you. And I didn't drop that one. To help you remember this. One more if I can do it. All right. Okay, Rebecca Ruckel actually helped me put this together. I appreciate her doing that. If you're going to have compassion for people who are guilty, you have to identify, you have to forgive first, identify, and trust. And so let's talk about what that means for just a few minutes. First of all, Jesus forgave those who were suffering from sin. For those who executed him, Jesus prayed, Father, forgive them. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. You know, when we are personally offended and we believe that someone owes us a personal debt, we're not going to have compassion for them. Agreed? And we're not going to comfort them. In fact, those who offend us will be the last people that we want to go and comfort. We will want to keep our distance from them when someone has personally offended us and owes us a personal debt. What that is called is judging someone, judging them. And so we're not going to show compassion for someone as long as we're judging them. Now, Jesus didn't deny that what was being done to him was wrong. It was wrong. He never denied it. But what Jesus did is that he forgave. He forgave those who executed him. And so Jesus in his heart was not holding on to a personal offense that was keeping him from showing compassion for those who executed him. He forgave them. As Jesus died on the cross, Jesus knew what was happening. He knew that his death would pay for the sins of the whole world. And I want you to understand something. He knew his death was going to pay for the sins of every person who'd ever been born, past, present, and future. He knew that. He knew that his death was going to pay for the sins of those who were killing him, of those who were executing him. And so, as a result, Jesus forgave because he understood their debt was paid by him. He released the offense because he knew their debt was paid by him. What this means is that Jesus has paid the debt for anyone who sins against me or anyone who sins against anyone I love. The debt has been paid before they commit the offense. And so who am I to hold on to the personal offense in my heart and judge them as if the debt has not been paid? It has been paid by Jesus, by his death on the cross. Forgiving someone is simply recognizing that their debt of sin has been paid by Jesus, and I'm not holding that debt against them. And I'm not judging them for their debt. In a fallen world, there needs to be laws of restitution for sin in order to deter sinners. And so in the law of Moses, for example, for the nation of Israel, you have all of these laws of restitution, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and so on and so forth. And I want you to understand something. When it comes to civil laws in a fallen world, those laws are absolutely imperfect to deter fallen people from sinning. I am glad that there are penalties for sin in our fallen world as a result. But everyone's sin debt, even before they sin, has already been paid. It's already been paid. Maybe their debt to society hasn't been paid, but their sin debt has been paid by Jesus once and for all and by his death on the cross. If I accept this truth, it frees me from judging people. And I want you to understand something. I am a judgment-free zone. You can share anything with me about what you've ever done, and I will not judge you because your debt has already been paid by Jesus Christ. Who am I? Who am I to act as if your debt hadn't been paid when Jesus paid it all? Judgment can be displaced by compassion when we forgive. But I want you to know, if we don't forgive and we don't consider people's sin debt to be paid, no matter what the sin is, no matter how gross the sin may be to us, we cannot have compassion for them in our hearts until we first forgive them the way Jesus forgave those who were executing him on the cross. Jesus had compassion for sinners because he forgave them. Is there anyone right now that you need to forgive? Just say, Jesus paid their debt of sin. Who am I? Who am I to hold on to a debt that Jesus says has already been paid? Second thing that Jesus did in order to have compassion, I would say that's the most important one. You won't get off first base unless you do that one, is he identified. He identified with the pain and the hurt that others were going through due to sin. You see, there were two thieves being executed with Jesus. And these two thieves were suffering for a sin they did commit. Now, your justice meter should be going off there, by the way. Do you think that people should be executed on crosses for stealing? No, I don't believe that. In fact, in the law of Moses talks about what is a just compensation for someone who has stolen something. And it's not execution on a cross, by the way. And I'm so glad because I'd already be dead because I've stolen many things during the course of my childhood for sure. And so, yeah, that's not right. But he was being executed for a sin he committed. Jesus was suffering for a sin he did not commit. But what Jesus had in common with both thieves is that they were all three suffering for sin. That's what they all had in common. They were all suffering for sin. And so Jesus had compassion for them because he identified with them. They were all suffering for sin. Identification. We can see his compassion when he comforted the thief who believed in him. Only one of the thieves believed in him, and Jesus, he had compassion for the other guy, but the other guy didn't believe in him. And so we see his compassion for the thief who believed in him. He comforted him. What did he say? He said, well, today you will be with me in paradise. That was the way he comforted him, is with the truth. Jesus first identified with sinners suffering from sin by becoming a man. He didn't start suffering when he died on the cross. I mean, when God became a man and took on the form of man, he entered into a sinful world and he began to suffer as a man. Jesus was 100% God, but he was 100% man. He was a human being, and that means that he suffered from hunger. That means that he suffered from thirst. That means that he suffered from the elements. He could get cold. He could get hot. Jesus suffered mental and emotional anguish from the sins of others. He suffered rejection from his own family. He suffered rejection from his own people. Terrible things were said about Jesus. And so he suffered mental and emotional anguish from the sins of others. At the end of his life, he suffered this physical pain on the cross from sin. Not because he had sinned, but because he was choosing to bear the sin of the world. He was suffering from sin along with these two thieves. Jesus had empathy for sinners suffering from sin because he entered into our suffering with us. And he knows what it's like to suffer. You know, if you and I visited inmates in prison, you would be able to see inmates in the prison comforting other inmates that are suffering because they can identify with one another's suffering and what caused it. They'll comfort each other. If you went to a hospital and you visited the chemo unit, you would find chemo patients comforting other patients that are suffering because they identify with one another's suffering and what caused it. If you visit a brothel, you would find prostitutes comforting other girls that are suffering because they identify with one another's suffering and what caused it. If you visit a street gang, you would find gang members comforting other gang members that were suffering because they identify with one another's suffering and what caused it. You see, here's the truth. You will have compassion for people and comfort them when you identify with their suffering and what caused it, like Jesus did. This is called empathy. You know, I may not be able to identify with everything that you've ever gone through in your life and every suffering that you've experienced, but I can identify with you in that both you and I are suffering due to sin. And that's not going to stop until this mortality gives way to immortality. I'm going to continue to suffer due to sin until that happens. And so I can identify with you and empathize with you even when I haven't experienced the exact suffering that you're going through. Or maybe I haven't committed the sin that you've committed, that you're experiencing suffering from. It doesn't matter. We're both sinners. I understand suffering due to sin. And so did Jesus, because he took upon our sin in order to pay our sin debt. Jesus had compassion for sinners because he identified with those who were suffering and why they were suffering because of sin. And then Jesus had compassion and comforted those who were guilty because he trusted God the Father with whatever the Father wanted to do with him. It all comes down to that always. When it comes to making changes in our life, it comes down to trust and faith. And that's what Jesus did. The last words of Jesus on the cross before he died, he spoke to his Father and he said, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." That is a picture of just absolute abandonment. Into your hands I commit my spirit. He just was surrendering fully, to the will of the Father for his life, for his existence. These were his last words, but these words, "Into thy hands I commit my spirit," were indicative of just how Jesus lived his life. He obeyed the Father, and he trusted his Father to do with him whatever the Father wanted to do with him. Jesus forgave sinners, and he identified with them his whole life. He didn't start with the thief on the cross. I want you to understand something about forgiving sinners and identifying with them. It's reckless. It's absolutely reckless to do that. In fact, I would tell you that it's dangerous. And Jesus constantly put himself in harm's way by showing compassion for guilty people. Constantly he did that in order to comfort them. Jesus dealt with fear by trusting God the Father with whatever happened. "Here you go, Lord. Into thy hands I commit my spirit." And he lived his whole life. He lived his whole life that way. And as a result, he didn't live in fear. See, what I know about us as human beings is that one of the things that keeps us from forgiving people and identifying with people that are guilty is we're afraid. And the only way that you and I are going to overcome that fear is to entrust ourselves and surrender to God, no matter what the outcome is. Lord, here I am. Whatever you want to do, whatever you want to happen, that's it. You know, we see this all the time in those who are going on the mission field to some difficult place to share the gospel. I mean, they're stepping into places where people don't want them to be, where there possibly could be the persecution of civil authorities if they profess Jesus and began to preach the gospel to other people. And they go anyway. And we look at those missionaries and we say, "My, why do you do that?" Well, I can tell you why they do that. They have compassion. They believe that Jesus died for the sins of the world, not just their sins, not just the sins of Americans. They identify with people that are suffering from sin. But then what we see is these missionaries are bold and courageous. And the reason they're bold and courageous, putting themselves in harm's way to share the gospel, is because they trust God the Father with their lives. And whatever happens to them, it happens. It's up to you, Father. Into thy hands I commit my spirit. If you forgive sinners and identify with them and try to comfort them, I want to tell you this right now, and just be absolutely honest. You're going to get hurt. If you form real life relationships with people and you invest in them the way I'm talking about here, I want you to know what's going to happen. You're going to get hurt. At least emotionally. I don't know what's going to happen physically, if you'll ever get beat up or something like that. But I can tell you this. You form real life relationship with guilty people and you're going to get hurt emotionally. What I'm encouraging you to do is be like Jesus. Follow him. Don't let that stop you. Say to Jesus, "Jesus, here I go. Into your hands I commit my life, my spirit. Do with me what you want to do." Let me ask you. There's a reason why I did it this way. Sometimes somebody's suffering and we'll see somebody not being sensitive and we'll say, "Well, have a heart." Right? Have a heart, you know? Do you have a heart for people that are suffering from the guilt of sin? Do you have a heart? In order to have that heart, you're going to have to forgive. You're going to have to identify. And you're going to have to trust in your life. Pray with me, would you? I just want to talk to you for just a moment while you have your heads bowed. I'm so excited about what God's doing at Western Hills. And one of the reasons why I'm excited is I'm seeing all kinds of people with a heart for people that are guilty. It's not been unusual at Western Hills for me to see people with a heart for people that are innocent, at least in our minds, because, really no one's innocent. But I am seeing people having compassion for people that are guilty of terrible things. I want you to know I couldn't be more excited about being the pastor here at Western Hills and seeing that happen. It's an amazing thing to watch unfold as I see it happen. If you will forgive, identify, and trust, you will have a heart for those people that need it the most because they're suffering the most. In other words, here's what will happen. You will mourn with the prostitute that gets a disease due to her sexual immorality. You'll mourn with her. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. You will mourn with the pedophile that goes to prison. You will mourn with the adulterous man that is divorced because of his unfaithfulness. You will mourn with businessmen that commits fraud and goes to prison. You will mourn with a substance abuser that is diagnosed with hepatitis C. You will mourn with a homosexual that gets HIV or perhaps AIDS. You will mourn with the illegal immigrant that is arrested by civil authorities and separated from their family. You will mourn with them if you follow Jesus, if you forgive, if you identify, and if you trust. You will mourn with those who are guilty. So do you have a heart for all people? Not just some people. But do you have a heart for all people? If you do, you will have real life relationships with people that are suffering from all kinds of sins. You will reach them with the gospel one person at a time. The gospel of Jesus Christ changes religious hypocrites into compassionate caregivers that comfort even the guilty when they are suffering. Have you received Jesus? Why would you not want to follow Jesus after I just brought you this message? Because you see, the way that I described him for these other people, he's that way for you. He's forgiving. He paid your sin debt. He identifies with your suffering from sin. He became a man so he would know exactly what you were experiencing as a human being. He identifies with your pain. He just wants you to trust him. Would you receive Jesus right now for the forgiveness of your sin, believing that when he did die on the cross, he died for you? And if you would you just turn to him right now and say, Jesus, I receive you for the forgiveness of my sin. I believe you paid my sin debt. I believe that you identify with my suffering, my pain. I trust you, Jesus, right now as my personal Savior and Lord. Would you do that right now? That's all you have to do, is turn to him and say, I receive you, Jesus. Would you do that? Just pray it to him right now. If you did, the next step for you is to be baptized. Follow him in baptism. And in order to do that, here's what I want you to do today. I want you to take one of those Connect cards that was on one of those packages, and I want you to fill it out, and I want you to put on there, I received Jesus today, and I want to be baptized. There's not a more important decision you can make in your whole life. And I assure you'll never regret it, having a relationship with a God like the one I described this morning. Will you receive Jesus? If you have received Jesus, are you going to follow him? Folks, are we as a church going to follow him? Are you compassionate and do you comfort even those who are guilty of sin? Even those who personally offended you? Do you consider their sin debt to be paid because Jesus paid it all? And refuse to judge them. Refuse it. And love them anyway. Will you follow Jesus? Will you forgive? Will you identify with the suffering of sinners, no matter what their sin is? Will you trust God with whatever He wants to do with your life, one person at a time? What a life. Will you follow Jesus? I'm seeing an army growing. It's an army of recruits that are wanting real life relationships with sinners. We're right on the precipice. We're close to that. Just when it breaks out, you'll know it, because it'll just blow the walls off this place when it finally happens. We won't be able to contain the people when our church fellowship starts really following Jesus and has compassion for people that are guilty of sin, because we forgive, we identify, and we trust. Will you follow Jesus or not? Let's follow Him. Let's see what God will do. Thank you, Father, for this time today and what you're doing in our midst. We love you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. I think we're going to end with the prayer meeting again today, aren't we? I'm going to turn it over to Brandon.
If you didn't get a command card on a packet, then you can find one in the back of the chair. But we really would love to celebrate with you what God is doing in your heart. If you have